Allen, and we're happy to have you all here. I'm glad to see such big numbers. And I'm going to introduce today's moderator, who is David Nachimson. Oh my God, I messed up your name, Nachimson, who comes to us from Molefi College as an access service librarian. Sorry, David.
No, that was really good, Tracy. Thank you. Tracy Allen, everybody from Rensselaer Polytechnic in Troy, New York. Okay, so welcome everybody. This is effectively our keynote panel, we're calling it, of the combating racism in libraries panel, or webinar series, I should say. And we have two distinguished panelists who are joining us for this kickoff. First of all, Mr. Andrew Jackson, an activist librarian, library consultant, advisor, and award-winning published author and essayist. Among his awards and honors, Andrew was the recipient of the Black Caucus of the American Library Association's 1999 Library Advocacy Award, Queens Public Library's Lamplighter of the Year Award, the 2007 BC ALA Professional Development Award, the 2011 NYLA Outstanding Service to Libraries Award, the 2012 BCALA DEMCO Award for Excellence in Librarianship, and BCALA's 2013 Outstanding Contribution to Publishing Citation. Recognized for his community service and extensive outreach, he presented Black History Talks with inmates on Rikers Island and other New York City correctional facilities over a 14-year period, and served as a consultant advisor to libraries in New York, North Carolina, and Florida. Jackson also mentors numerous graduate students and young librarians across the country. Today, Andrew is a member of Queens Public Library's Board of Trustees and an adjunct instructor at York College CUNY in Black Studies and at the Graduate School of Library and Information Studies at Queens College CUNY in Libraries in a Multicultural Society. Glad to have you with us today, Andrew. Our other panelist is Chenthu Jayachandiran, who is a 15-year veteran in the field of higher education administration, working to advance the diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice agenda. An immigrant from Sri Lanka, Chenthu started his journey at the University of Wisconsin-Superior, earning his bachelor's degree in international peace studies and legal studies, and his master's degree in higher education counseling. After a stint at Western Washington University in student affairs, he began his doctoral work in communication studies at the University of Iowa. As a critical cultural scholar, his research examines everyday conversations about race and ethnicity. In his most recent work at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, he was responsible for overall strategy for the support of minoritized communities and the overall cultural education of the student population. As the newly appointed director of the Cultural Center and Spiritual Life at the University of Denver, he hopes to continue his advocacy, support, and education work. Glad to have you with us, Chenthu.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Okay, so we're going to get the conversation started. And since we're kicking off this 6-part series on combating racism, I think it falls upon us to establish some definitions. So I'm going to ask a pretty blunt and broad question to our panelists to start this off. How should we define racism?
Well, I'll start. I went to the Merriam-Webster dictionary to get a formal definition of racism. They say that it's the belief that different races possess distinct characteristics, abilities, or qualities, especially so as to distinguish them as inferior or superior to another. And the other part that I thought was even more prophetic was the systematic oppression of a racial group to the social, economic, and political advantage of another group.
Yeah, and from the critical cultural perspective, the definition of racism is a hierarchical ordering of races, and assigning meaning and value that positions certain races as fundamentally superior or better than the others. And in this case, the physical attributes, skin color, facial structure, etc., are the kind of meaning-making units that you organize into this larger system to say, this is race, and then you kind of create this hierarchical ordering that places whiteness at the top of that ordering. And then, you know, from there, everything else that Andrew's talking about flows, right? The systems, the pedagogy, the ways of knowing, the ways of interacting, all of which that again positions whiteness at the top.
And I think the other ingredient that that is embedded in that is that if the person who is practicing that racism has the power over other people to instill the sense of inferiority and their superiority over other people, and that element is key to being successful at predicating racism, is having that power.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So another big question that you both can tackle as best you can. So how has that phenomenon played itself out over the course of American history? What are some key milestones of that we should be aware of?
Here in this country,
Yes.
could you trace racism and the power of using race as a predominant element, going back to the enslavement of free African people and bringing them here to be used as free slave labor to build this country. And that goes back as early as the 1400s, but we primarily know about it in terms of the power of the racism in the 1700s during the slave trade, with the millions of Africans who were enslaved brought from the continent through the Caribbean here to the Americas.
And you know, the idea of power really is central to any conversation about racism, right? So if you conceptualize power as the ability or the process whereby which valued symbolic resources are granted or withheld, and then the systematic application of that power to withhold valued resources to a particular population, ultimately is the kind of grounding tenet of racism, right? Because what you're doing then is you are identifying things that people need to be functioning citizens, to be functioning human beings, and saying, we're going to withhold that from you. And we're going to do that systematically, historically, over an extended period of time. And then that's how you end up with where we are right now, right? So if a valued resource is, is wages, so that you can pay your way to live a life of dignity, and you withhold that systematically, then you end up with the kind of history that we have in the United States. And that's what's continuing to happen even now, right? We're creating systems that withhold valued resources to people of different races.
I think it's also key when you're talking about the slave trade. Africans were free on the continent, and the power, particularly with the weaponry that was used to control the Africans on the continent, they were enslaved, put in shackles, and the mental process of making them slaves and the seasoning through the Caribbean, keeping them in shackles from the time they were captured until the time they were actually sold, and even on the plantation, instilling that mental sense of inferiority, and that they had no power to free themselves. They had no power to control, to do anything for themselves. And as men, no power to save your children, to be able to save your wife or your family, or to protect your family, was a sense of power that was used continuously over Africans. And then later on the plantation, after they had been transferred from being Africans to being slaves, and that mental acceptance of slavery was the power that if you do anything wrong, I will sell your wife. If you do anything wrong, I will sell your children. So again, you go back to that concept of the key element that power had over African people through the slave trade, through Reconstruction, through the second domestic slave trade, through the plantation life, through continuously, even through the civil rights movement, particularly in the South. was that power that people had over other people, that they could not control themselves, and that we were not as good as the white people that were in power. And no matter whether the white people were intelligent or ignorant or couldn't read or illiterate, they were still, because they were white, they were more powerful and they had control of the lives that black people did not have.
So what about in the years after the end of slavery, the Emancipation Proclamation and all that? What prevented Black people from attaining a power that allowed them to be equal to white people?
One is access to education. They were not. That was one of the reasons they were prevented. It was illegal for them to learn how to read and write. It was illegal for them to get educations. Part of the Reconstruction positive elements was that schools were opening up so that the education was always considered the key to freedom, and taking people off of the plantation life where they had no skills other than the craft skills they may have had, to teach them how to read, write, count, be able to take control over their lives. Education played a key role in that. But still, you get off the plantation and you had to have money, and we didn't have money because we weren't being paid. So there were a lot of different elements that still controlled Black people even during Reconstruction and after Reconstruction. Being free technically meant nothing if you couldn't control your life.
Yeah. And I think there's another key component to that idea of power, right? So let me offer you a different definition of power, right? And this is very Foucauldian, the idea that power is the ability to make truth claims, right? To say something and to have it treated as legitimate, valid, or true. Now, post-emancipation, certainly, technically they were free, but they were never granted the ability to actually make a claim of truth, of validity, and have it be treated as legitimate, right? So a Black person post-emancipation could still not say, I deserve to be treated with dignity, and have anybody treat that as something legitimate. And in some ways, that kind of power is still not afforded to people of color, right? Like, even now, if we look at the industry of knowledge production, right? Professors writing papers, that Black voice is still missing, or it's still underrepresented. They are still not able to make truth claims and have it treated as legitimate and valid. So this idea, the idea of emancipation only gets us so far until we get to the point where POCs, Black people can make truth claims and have it in broad circulation. They are still denied that essential part of power, and we're going to be stuck here for a while if that kind of power isn't granted.
And if you look at the conditions that Africans faced after they were freed at the end of the Civil War, during Reconstruction, even through the Civil Rights Movement, that freedom meant that they were no longer not being paid for their labor, but now they would be hired by the same people who controlled them and owned them, and they were still, basically they were still property because now they were sharecropping, or they didn't own land, and the land that was given to them at some time as part of that Reconstruction of 40 acres and a mule, that was systematically taken away from them. So the ownership of being able to own their own land, have control over their own lives, still did not take place. And in many cases, particularly in the southern states, they were on plantation lives and sharecropping and still fighting to get control over their lives. Without that control, you still were not free.
Okay, great. I want to actually shift the conversation now to a more personal direction. Andrew, you are an African-American, and Chenthu, you are an immigrant to the United States from Asia. And I'd like to hear from both of you how you first learned about, became aware of, were exposed to the experience of racism in America.
My parents come from Vicksburg, Mississippi, and migrated to Brooklyn, New York, and later Queens, New York, where we were raised, as part of the Great Migration in the 40s. They taught us about racism because they had grown. My mother and father both come from Vicksburg, Mississippi. Both of them experienced racism surviving in Vicksburg, Mississippi. So we were I'm the oldest of a set of triplets. My older brother and sister were born and came to New York while they were in middle school, elementary and middle school. So we were the product of a New York life. They were the product of a Southern life. And they taught us what they went through. Every time we'd have the family gatherings of other family members who also came from Mississippi, we heard those stories. We learned about those things that they experienced. And that was our introduction to what racism was. I didn't face racism myself that I can remember until I was out of high school and went into the Air Force and was stationed in Texas. And somebody called me a nigger in the barracks. That's the first time I'd ever been called a nigger. And it turned into a very volatile situation, but I didn't face that when I was growing up in New York. And I went to predominantly white high school, a predominantly white middle school, but there was a commonality of purpose for the students there that we learned from each other. We interacted with each other. So I didn't face that in New York, but I faced that when I went down to Texas to Lackland Air Force Base when I went into the Air Force. That was my first introduction face to face to having been dealing with the concept of being called a nigger.
Yeah, for me, growing up in Sri Lanka, I grew up in the midst of a 40-year civil war, right? So this idea of ethnic hierarchies was where I first learned about this kind of social classification system. Now, I was born into a Tamil family, so we were the minority in Sri Lanka. So growing up in that environment, I was introduced to this idea of social hierarchies based on ethnicities. My first introduction to racism in the United States was after I moved to Wisconsin. And I'm a very dark-skinned person, right? And if you look from afar, most people mistake me for black. And my first introduction was, I was walking down Kathleen Avenue at the University of Wisconsin Superior, and this car drove by with a bunch of high school students, and they yelled the N-word at me, and I yelled back, "I'm Asian, you idiot," right? But that was my first introduction to kind of racism in the United States. Certainly, America's struggles with race extend far beyond your borders. Living in Sri Lanka, we knew about racism in the United States. I grew up reading about Martin Luther King, so it certainly, there was that introduction, but the personal experience of being kind of confronted with racism in the United States, that was in Wisconsin when someone just yelled the N-word at me. Certainly more recent experiences, encounters with law enforcement. I got plenty of stories of that, but that was my first one.
Very interesting. Okay, so I'd like to talk a little bit now about the barriers that we face as a society to breaking down racism. So this is kind of a two-part question. The first question is, what implicit biases do native-born Americans learn as they're growing up in this country?
When I looked at that, I saw that in a number of ways. One, I think it depends on the culture that somebody comes from, is what biases you come with.
Okay.
that they vary by culture, by person, by family, because you really, you inherit the biases of those who raise you and teach you and educate you in terms of what the culture is. Some other biases would be as Chenthu indicated about skin color, hair texture, facial features, cultural names, religions. So there are different biases that people bring with themselves to interact with the global community. And it's a prejudice in favor. Sometimes it's in favor, sometimes it's against one person or another group, and usually considered an unfair bias. But it varies with the different people.
Yeah, and you know, the reason why it's called implicit biases is this because this idea of meaning making isn't something we do consciously, right? In communication studies, we talk about meaning making as a process, right? You accumulate certain symbols, you cluster them together, and you give it a meaning. And then you accumulate more of those smaller meaning units, and you organize it into a larger meaning, right? So for instance, skin color, facial features, etc., can create this meaning of race, of blackness. But then when you create a larger meaning of, a professional, right, a well-educated person, then what you do is you collect other meaning units, race, education, socioeconomic status, etc., and then you cluster them together and you say, this is what a well-educated person looks like, right? So that's kind of the meaning-making process. We take small units of symbols, cluster them, create one meaning, then you take clusters of smaller meaning units and you make a larger meaning. So now, for instance, let's say the salient meaning that we're making is criminal, right? And this is what happened with the Amy Cooper situation in Central Park. Let's say the salient meaning that was going to be made was criminal. Unfortunately, one of the kind of things that we use to make sense of this idea of a criminal might be race. It might be attire. It might be tattoos. It might be expressions of anger, whatever it is, right? So this idea then of implicit bias is, what are those smaller units of meaning that form a larger kind of salient meaning in an instant? That is how implicit bias works, right? So in terms of where do we get these biases, it's a subconscious process. It's about all of the media that you consume, all of the narratives that you consume from the people that you live and work with. It's from the culture that you grow up in, like Andrew said, right? So that's kind of the process that we have to reverse engineer if we want to work past these biases. We have to reverse engineer it in a way that says, when we're thinking about a criminal, race shouldn't be part of the meaning making process, or can we get past that?
I would also add that the extent of your bias is also dependent on your exposure. If you are in a predominantly white community and you don't really interact with Black people or other cultures, then your exposure to them is limited. And your biases are derived from social media, from what you see in films, what you see on the news, what you hear, what you're taught. And that may not be a reality at all, because somebody else's biases may be predicated on their exposure or a negative experience. And then when you come in contact with people of different cultures and you see they're not what you expected them to be, then all of a sudden they become the exception instead of the norm. So your exposure, if you're exposed to what you see on the social media, and you can tell by what happens today with some of the issues that are coming up on social media, some of the things that are said in social media, they're not always true. But if that's what your exposure is, then you go by what you hear on social media. So exposure has a lot to do with it as well. If you're in a limited environment and not exposed to multiculturalism on a regular basis, then you really don't know anything about what it is to be Black or to be around Black people or Asian people or Native American or Latino. You only go by what you hear or what you're told, what you see on another form, TV, rap videos, news, whatever it is. So that has a great deal to do with it as well.
Very interesting. When I worked in the Bronx, I had the experience with some regularity of patrons confiding in me their racist views. And these were people that lived in a very mixed neighborhood, but somehow managed to be isolated, or somehow managed to isolate themselves from people who weren't like them. How can we deal with that?
I think that there's a couple of things, right? Certainly, there are those who are willfully avoiding that exposure that can kind of deconstruct some of those biases. There are those people, and you know, that's a different question altogether, right? For the other folks who are kind of participating in this racist project unwittingly, that I think is where most of our work lies. And one of the things, you know, whenever I'm talking to my students, I'll tell them, you know, go look at your Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn network. See how many people of color you have. And if your network is predominantly white, if you didn't know it before, now you do. Now the question is, what are you going to do about it, right? Because when you start diversifying your network, what you'll notice is because of the way algorithms work, when you start diversifying your network, you're now exposed to stories and experiences that counter the dominant narrative that exists that you might be exposed to, that says, you know, POCs are lazy, are angry, are criminals, et cetera, et cetera. Because when you change your network, when you change the circles that you move in, then what you get is stories that contradict these kind of destructive narratives that we have. And that's really the only way to change it, because Andrew's spot on, that when you increase exposure to people, then you eventually get to this critical mass of exposure that says, oh, that isn't the exception. That is actually the norm, right? And that's the problem we have, because most people, when you encounter an articulate Black man, they say, oh, I encountered an articulate Black man, without stopping to think, oh, maybe all Black men are articulate, right? It's so easy for them to put them in the category of the exception and not the norm. The only way you do that is by getting to this critical mass of stories that say, no, that is the norm.
All right, very good, thank you. I'm going to interrupt this part of the conversation for a question from the audience. It reads, good afternoon. Is it assumed that POW Africans were illiterate as slaves, or did they just not know the oppressor's language, English? Or in some cases Spanish, I suppose.
Yeah, for the most part, the Africans were illiterate they were literate because they were not allowed to learn how to read. They were not allowed to access the books, and they were taught. They were not allowed to practice their own African tongues. And there were various languages that they had coming from the continent. Everything, particularly here in America, all of the traits that were considered African, their names, their culture, their religions, their practices, their values, their mores, everything was stripped from them as part of the seasoning process to take them, to translate them, to transform them from being free Africans and proud Africans to being savages and slaves. So they were taught the English language. They were not allowed to practice their religions. They were given Christianity as their new religion. And the religion that they were given used the Bible and Christianity and the church to reinforce that they were inferior to their master. And they created that master-slave relationship. So no, they were taught English, but they were taught, and sometimes you look at some of the broken English that you hear in the slave narratives, because they were coming from different tongues. There were over 1,200 different languages spoken on the African continent. So they were coming from their different African cultures and practices and had to be forced to learn. They would take, if you go back to that scene in Roots where Toby is tied to a tree, Kunta Kinte is tied to a tree, and the slave, not master, but the component of the slave master is whipping him until he accepts the gift from his slave master of a new name named Toby and taking away his African name of Kunta Kinte. That's that same concept of mental slavery and reinforcing the master-slave relationship and taking away his power as a free African and making him a subservient, inferior Black man as a slave. So yes, they were taken away from being African. They had to learn the English language in order to survive, but they were no longer African. And then if you go generation after generation, by the second or third generations, they didn't see themselves as African. They saw themselves as slaves.
All right. Go ahead, Chenthu.
And the modern day kind of iteration of that same story is when you're sitting in a room interviewing candidates for a position, and a Black person slips into Ebonics, right? And suddenly they're treated as unintelligent and therefore they don't get the job. That still happens, right? Again, it's this idea of unless you speak and embody whiteness personified with proper English and proper grammar, you're denied that valued resource, dignity, or employment. So in some ways, this kind of this stripping away of the Africanness of the Black community still happens in very, very subtle, well, maybe not so subtle ways. So the next time you're in a job interview and you hear a Black man speak in Ebonics, don't think that they don't know how to speak a language. Instead, recognize that they're paying homage to their own cultural identity.
Several years ago, there was and I can't remember, it was a show that's not on any longer. It was on for maybe a couple of seasons. And they were interviewing two different managers, HR managers, about the issues that Black people go through trying to get interviews. And the question was about having these African names. Now, I'll use one of my African names. My African name is Sekou Molefi Baako. And if that's on the resume, and I apply for a job, all of a sudden people can't pronounce those names. So they set it aside because you're not going to get the interview. And they had different women who were saying, they were all qualified. It had nothing to do with qualifications. They were all qualified, the same qualifications of master's degrees and et cetera, work experience, et cetera, published, et cetera, as they white candidates, but the white candidates got the interview and they didn't. And they said they found that the problem, as according to the HR managers, was the fact that they had Black sounding names. And based on bias, the bias was that if they had those Black sounding names, they weren't going to work as hard as the white person was, and they were going to be lazy and they were going to be late to work, all these biases that came with it. So they said, okay, we tried a trick. They were told to resubmit their resume, and instead of using their name, put their initials. So instead of Shaniqua Jones, it was C. Jones. And every one of the 5 people that were turned down the first time was given an interview the second time, and 4 of the 5 people got the job after they got the interview. So those, again, we go back to biases based on somebody's power over conducting or not conducting an interview based on the sounding of somebody's name and what you think about when you hear that name. That's the same thing we're talking about.
I want to share a comment from the audience that I think is somewhat relevant and an interesting comparison. Assimilation also occurred with Native Americans too. The difference of assimilation and acculturation.
Right.
So yes, even the people that we were talking before the webinar started about the phrase native-born Americans, which I included in my question set, and how that's maybe not exactly the best term to describe those of us that were born in this country but aren't native to it. I do want to squeeze this question in here before we proceed, because one of our co-sponsors is the Ethnic Services Roundtable, and that's where the idea for this series originated. What views and attitudes about racism do immigrant groups come to America with? Chenthu, do you want to start with that one since you are a member of an immigrant group?
Yeah, sure. I think, like many people, I was exposed to a lot of the same narratives that most, we'll use the term native-born Americans were exposed to. So certainly, I wasn't immune to the lazy black man narrative or the angry black woman narrative. I was exposed to that, and the counter is also true, right? Like the narratives about white Americans, I was exposed to as well, right? The week before I flew to Sri Lanka, one of my uncles told me, why do you want to go to the United States? They just have too much money and time on their hands, and they just kill their own kids, right? This was right after Columbine happened. So the exposure, what immigrants learn isn't that much different from what most other people learn, simply because of the power and the reach of the American media apparatus, right? There is a very strong Westernization agenda that extends all the way east. So I was exposed to all of those narratives, but the difference is, because of the color of my skin, I was more exposed to narratives that contradicted a lot of those earlier narratives, right? Like because of my skin, I was allowed into circles where people with darker skin were more present. So I had lots of opportunities to kind of change the impressions that I had, which I think is the problem. There aren't too many of those opportunities for white presenting people.
What's been your experience, Andrew, with that phenomenon?
I think that goes back to depending on the culture that you come from as to what biases you come here, or the attitudes.
Even more cultures, when we're talking about immigrant groups, there's even more cultures than we have, born in America.
Right. And a lot of people come to this country believing that there are more opportunities here than they might find in their home countries. What I found talking to my students in my library science, libraries in the multicultural society, one of the attitudes and impressions they come here with is that Americans have no values and they're immoral based on what they see and what they're exposed to in other countries. That we have a superior attitude. We're prejudiced over immigrant groups. That there's more government aid available here because the government takes care of its people, and that's not the case in other countries. But you can get a better education here. So a lot of different attitudes and biases or impressions that people come to the Americas with. I think they find, I know some of my students said they found when they got here and they started interacting with American people, they found that things were a lot different than they were led to believe before they got here from other countries.
Great, thank you. I have another question from the audience, and this one is leading us into the realm of what we can do in libraries to face this situation in a more practical way. How can one find out who in a Black community might be open to working with a local nonprofit to develop programs or policies that might help reduce inequality and increase minority access to services and self-determination?
I would, that's an interesting question. There's no one place to go, but I would look at the Black churches in the community. I would look at the library as an information source of who the leadership are, the cultural groups, the civic associations, the community planning board leaders, the political organizations, And the library usually has a roster of the people who are considered community leaders in their neighborhoods, that if they don't have the answers, they can lead you to the avenues that you're looking for. But I would definitely use the resources in that community, the political groups, the civic associations, the educational programs in the churches for the main avenues of information.
I think we ignore the churches all too often in an effort to not cross a line, but that often is, you know, where the Black community, or where a lot of communities actually interact with each other.
And the people you're probably looking to contact are probably members of the major churches in that community. So that's another resource, definitely.
Chenthu, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, just one comment to add. I think one of the things that we have to consider is, again, it goes back to this idea of meanings, right? When we say we want someone to come and speak to our audience, what are we considering the qualifications to be, right? Do they have to be someone with degrees? So do they have to be someone with publications? Do they have to be someone with social standing, et cetera, et cetera? Now, all of that is well and good. But here's the problem with that. We have to think about what percentage of the Black population has all of those things, all of those criteria, and will be treated as valid and legitimate to speak in front of an audience. Because when we do that and we eliminate people because of that criteria, we're already participating in this colonizing project, right? We're already saying some stories are not valid or relevant enough to be heard and legitimized. So I would just caution us to think about that, because even the stories of Black people who aren't community leaders, who don't have those degrees, those are stories that also need to enter the mainstream. So just a word of caution on that.
Good word, yes.
I totally agree with that.
Go ahead. Did you want to add to that, or Andrew?
No, I said I totally
agree. Okay, very good.
Yeah.
I wanted to share another comment from the audience in response to Andrew's comments about African names on job applications. The comment is, there have also been many research studies on the effect of Muslim sounding names on the job process. And I'm sure that that's definitely true.
Yes.
Let's see. I have another question from the audience. Many white people are descendants of immigrants. Can the competition for jobs after the Great Depression add to the hostility white people learn from their families that trickle down to attitudes today? Thoughts on that? Either of you?
I think there are a couple of things, right? There is a vested interest in suggesting that social wellness is a zero-sum game, that if for some people to win, some people have to lose, right? And that's how we kind of pit the various minoritized communities against each other. And the only thing that happens when when we play that picture out is that the norm setting, the dominant cultures are the ones that thrive. And I also want to kind of enter another kind of concept into the conversation, and that is that for the longest time, we have considered racism a moral issue, and it certainly is. I'm not saying it isn't. But racism is also a practical issue, right? Now, if we look at the demographic trends of the planet, we know that by 2040, 2050, the majority of the population isn't going to be white, right? So that means the people who are creating, who are thinking, who are distributing, who are selling, who are servicing people have to be conversant, have to be able to work across cultures for them to be successful, viable thinkers or practitioners, right? So at some point, the racism stops being the moral issue and becomes a pragmatic issue, right? So it serves us well to be able to work across cultures, right? So this idea that, you know, for me to succeed, someone else has to be left out of the equation is no longer true. If anything, for me to succeed, someone else has to be part of the equation. So I would just try to kind of reframe the way we think about that.
Yeah. And in some circumstances, when the European immigrant explosion started coming into the United States, many of the jobs that they were seeking were jobs that only Black people were allowed to have at that point. And now all of a sudden, it becomes a conflict and becomes a competition with who can get the job and who's more qualified for the job. But there are a lot of different scenarios with that. Too often, as insinuated, people had to have somebody to blame for the lack of access of jobs, the lack of access for housing, the lack of access for opportunities, and they're looking for somebody to persecute for it. This is why I can't succeed. But there are different scenarios that happen over time. But at one point, it was there because the Black people would, the only jobs Black people could get were the jobs that were given to them. And now that the immigrant populations came in, they were able to get jobs that we were no longer eligible for. And that's just one scenario, though.
Okay, a lot of good questions are coming in, but I want to go back to my question list. I want to get some key questions from the last section of it in before we run out of time. So I'm going to ask another big question. How do you see the conversation about racism in America having shifted since the murder of George Floyd just a few months ago?
I think the fact that you're even having a panel like this might not have happened before this Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd and all the other deaths and interaction with the police. I think the avenue of conversation is opening up. And these are conversations that have been needed for years. We have not been able to. When I talk to my students, I tell them, you know, by all intents and purposes, we are now closing out the first quarter of the 21st century. These conversations should have been over long. We should be past this by now. But the fact that we're still dealing with these issues in the 21st century is because we've never really had a real valid, in-depth conversation about race and what race has done and what it has meant in this country. And all of this undercurrent that's been festering for years is now exploding out in the streets, in conversations, in panels, in discussions around the country. It's overdue. But we need to look at not only the discussion, but the solutions that we're going to work on towards coming to some ending and providing the concept of character is more important than the color of somebody's skin. And the things that Dr. King talked about, his beloved community, the American dream, as opposed to Malcolm X's American nightmare. And how you see that, depending on what community you come from or what point of privilege you come from, we need to have these, and we need to have honest, open discussions, but we need to start looking at, as an end result of the discussions, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to stop this? How are we going to end this? And we have a difficult situation. Not only the politics that's being played out in Washington and around the country, but the honesty of information that we're given is questionable when you totally rely on only one access of information. And this is where the library comes in. The library has to make sure that it provides not only access to information, but the information has to be objective, and it has to provide all points of view so that people can come to the library, gather and come to the panel, come to the lecture, come to the debate, and have access to information so that they can make up their own minds based on honest, objective information.
Great, thank you. You answered my first question and the question I was going to ask after it. So that was very efficient of you. Chenthu, your thoughts?
Yeah, you know, this experience is mine, but I think there is some kind of broader applicability to it. I think for the first time in my memory, I am noticing that, it is worse to be a racist than to call out a racist in the United States, right? For the longest time, one of the hardest thing to do for anybody was to point to someone engaged in racist behavior and saying, hey, what you're doing is racist. That was hard for a long time. And the person who did that was persecuted more so than the racist. That has changed since George Floyd's murder. That is one of the things that I'm noticing. More people are actually kind of pointing it out and saying, that's not okay, that's racist. And people aren't being persecuted for that. Because what happened until George Floyd was that it took an immense amount of courage to actually call out racist actions. I think the fact that it is now more acceptable to say what you're doing is racist, what you're saying is racist, might be one of those crucial tipping points that was necessary to change normative behavior, right? Because if it requires that amount of courage and that amount of risk to contest racism, chances are fewer and fewer people will actually do it. I think making it easier to contest and challenge racism is a crucial kind of tipping point that I'm witnessing, at least in my circles, right? I'm hoping it's broader than my circle, because that I think is really important.
And what would you like to see libraries and other community institutions be doing systemically?
Yeah. I think part of it is creating the space for conversations, making it more normative to contest racism, right? Like that can't be a secret project. That can't be something that only happens in the back rooms, right? Creating or pushing the literature that contests that allows it, that encourages the contestation of it. I think that's really crucial. And part of it is showing the humanity of Black people, right? There is such a corpus of literature that positions Black people as slaves, as athletes, as entertainers, but not as thinkers, as practitioners, as intellectuals, right? So part of it is kind of reintroducing the humanity of Black people and immigrant people and indigenous people that, there's a history that says they're not. Because we're more likely to stand up for someone who we see as human. And if we don't see them as human, what's our incentive to stand up for them, right? So that's what I think.
I think that the other avenue, and to me it connects to the library, because you can't separate educational institutions and not have libraries, is the fact that we need to go back and re-edit the textbooks on history. History has been Eurocentrically presented. Typically, it begins in Europe and not in Africa, where society begins, where culture begins, where civilization begins. We re-edit the history books and we tell history as it actually happened. Again, in the 21st century, there should be no need for me to teach a Black Studies course. It should be taught as American history. There should be no need for Latino American history, or Caribbean American history, or Native American history, or Asian American history. That's all American history. And we don't teach it that way. We teach it as if these are separate things that happen at different times in different places. And until we re-edit the history books and we teach our children history as it actually happened beginning in Africa, that will change bias. That will change racism, because you'll be learning things about people of culture of different parts of the world and what they contributed with their participation and their role in civilization and their role in creating America. If you take away the contributions of African people, of Indian people, of Asian people, of Latino, Hispanic people, you're going to have a whole different America. So if we can change the educational system from scratch, from the time they're in daycare centers, and take them through college and universities, they're going to have a different opinion of the world, a different concept of multiculturalism, another impression of America. Because the impression we have today of America is very limited based on what we get out of our educational courses through high school. And if you go to college and you never take a Black history class or a Caribbean American class or Latino American class, you still come out miseducated. So we need to correct the educational systems as well. And with that, the books have to be in the libraries also to be exposed, whether they're electronic books or hard copies. The material needs to be available in the library.
Do we have anyone in the audience in educational publishing? I think we need a whole new webinar to reach out to them.
Yes.
Thank you. We're running out of time. I want to squeeze in a couple of more questions that are related to each other from the audience. The first question is, how do we as librarians reach out and bring different cultures to our public libraries and open dialogue in an honest and positive, productive program? But then right after that, we got a question that says, what do the speakers feel about the history of libraries asking organizations to provide programming and education for free? In this moment, many libraries are asking organizations of color to provide their anti-racism programming, adding further burden to these organizations that are already fighting inequity.
That's two major different questions. I think that the outreach into the community, one of the things that I'm known for the most with the 36 years of work that I did at Queens Library's Langston Hughes Community Library Culture Center is community outreach. To organizations, to communities, to schools, to fraternities and sororities, civic associations, and reaching the library and bringing those people into the library. The resources in your community need to be taken advantage of in some of those same places, the political groups, the churches, the cultural organizations, the nonprofits, anywhere you can reach out into your community, even going to things like the barbershop and the beauty shop to reach out to the people that don't come to the library, the non-users and the non-readers. Reaching out to those different assets and those different outreach sources in your community will make them part of the library and bring them into the library. Langston Hughes was the Black Heritage Library of Queens Library, but we had multicultural programs all of the time. We may have focused on the Black experience, but a lot of times I could take any of the culture groups that we brought into the library and show their connectedness to the Black experience. So that meant that we were all part of a continuum. And that is part of the way you bring people into the library and you reflect the community in your library. The other aspect, the first thing is we have to continue to dominate the discussion in Washington and in Albany and all the other capitals of the cities that are represented in this country, and Washington, D.C. in particular, about the value of libraries, the importance of libraries, and that funding for libraries is essential to a dynamic, productive community. And we're still arguing that, we're still fighting that. I go back to that ALA motto that libraries will take you to times of no money better than money will take you to times of no libraries. And that, I remember hearing that when Arthur Curley talked about that in the early days of my activism at ALA. It's still true today. Libraries are underfunded. Libraries are not one of the top agendas, even in our elected officials' budget items. We need to continue to fight that struggle. If you do that, it won't be, there'll be plenty of money, but not just the collections and the technology, but there'll be plenty of money for the programming that takes place in your library.
Great, I totally agree. Jeremy, can we get a couple of additional minutes to give Chenthu a chance to respond?
Sure, just a couple.
Just a couple, yes, I'm sorry. So many good questions are coming in. We could go on for another hour, but I think we're gonna have to wrap it up with this question. Chenthu, go ahead.
I think the only thing I'll say is that, you know, like libraries to me are the custodians of stories, right? And we can never underestimate the power of a well-placed, well-positioned, well-delivered story to change hearts and minds, right? Because laws and procedures are the safeguard that says when everything else fails, we will still protect our minoritized communities. But stories are what change people's hearts and minds. And, you know, and to me, libraries are custodians of that. Y'all hold the collective stories of the human experience in your hands. And, you know, the more people see themselves reflected in the stories that are told, the more likely they're going to participate. And to me, that's the power of the libraries. That's why I was so excited to participate in this conversation. So I'll just stop there. Thank you so much for giving me the chance to engage with all of you.
Thank you, Chenthu. That was a great way to conclude the program. And thank you, Andrew. It's been a great conversation. Thank you, everybody who listened to this. So sorry that we can't continue it now, but we will continue it with a fresh panel next Wednesday at 2 o'clock. Off the top of my head, and I don't have my notes in front of me, I don't know what that is, but you can find that on the NILA website. Jeremy, anything else to add before we say goodbye to everyone?
I'm happy to plug in the next session that is happening next Wednesday is using collection development and readers advisory to introduce race relations. So we look forward to seeing many of you back with us next week.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Have a wonderful rest of the day.